Good morning. Today I'm continuing to read my 2016 article in Action, Criticism, and Theory for Music Education called Music Educated and Uprooted, my story of rurality, whiteness, musicking, and teaching. I'm on page 44, the section labeled Homo Educandis Musicae. My experience with performing, personally fulfilling popular music on drum set, and my subsequent rejection of this type of musicking represents my evolution into a new being. She who believes music education is a basic human need, everybody ought to be music educated, and that music education is a prerequisite for meaningful musicking. Homo educandis musicae. Such is the result of my music education that, despite all of my experience with meaningful non-school musicking, I still evolved into Homo educandis musicae. I still gave up performing popular music so as to concentrate on classical percussion music, which I now think in many ways is far less sophisticated than popular drumming. This rejection of popular music for classical music can be understood as an institutionalization of values, which leads inevitably to physical pollution, social polarization, and psychological impotence. 3 dimensions in the process of global degradation and modernized misery, according to Ivan Illich. Homo educandis musicae, musicking values, are institutionalized values. Not only does Homo educandis musicae seek nourishment from the institution, music education, but she becomes a missionary whose calling it is to music educate those she sees as undeveloped masses, the under-music educated. Finally, Homo educandis musicae understands the institution. Music education is the best, or at least one of the best ways to save those undeveloped masses from mass poverty. And I end that section with a haiku. Institutionalized musics I coveted, the American dream. Yes, in that section, right, we have a personal evolution. Yummy, yummy. Growing up poor, I did not really grow up in the same culture at all as many Americans. I was not competitive with the global economy. I was in a family that was wrung out the back, right? My dad had tried to make it with his own businesses in construction around DC when I was young, and that had big challenges for our family, for the cohesion of our family, especially on my older brothers and sisters. Me, I was in 4th grade when my grandfather died, and we moved back. When we moved back, in a way, that was a dropout. In anarchism, there's this idea of a refusenik, right? Somebody who refuses to participate in capitalism as much as possible. Certainly, my parents did not have any kind of philosophical understanding of that refusenik aspect of anarchy. But, in a way, their Christian values stood, the blessedness of the poor throughout the Bible stood as a refusal to continue to harm themselves, right? For our family to continue to harm itself. My older sisters and brother took the biggest brunt of it because they were already in high school by the time my parents were able to get the trick that was played on them to come back and put values, Christian values, taking care of grandma, ahead of capitalist values. Values of success that they'd never achieved, that they ran against for 20 years. Similarly, I ran against my attempt for success even after this publication, trying to get a job in higher education. Regardless of how many publications I have, how good of a teacher I am, I've never been able to get a tenure line job, right? I was a finalist for something like 10 positions that were tenure line jobs. I got none of them. I was offered a part-time adjunct job at Penn State Altoona, which I took, and I was offered an adjunct job at University of Maine near the end of that, which I did not take. Rather than uproot my family again and move us further away from family than we already are. To the extent that I participate in this, I participate as a middle school music teacher now in a poor rural county. In fact, I think it's third or fourth poorest county in Pennsylvania. So many of my students are not polluted by this evolution, right, into Homo educandus. Many of them understand that they learn things outside of school intuitively. The things that were so radical that I was saying to educated people are just common sense knowledge to so many of the social majorities, to most of the people. Still, I don't go completely back to being social majorities. One cannot throw off entirely the shackles of their education, can they? But that sounds harsher than I meant it, harsher than it sounded in my head when it was coming out. But our education changes us, right? It transforms us. And you can't go back, right? A butterfly cannot go back to being a caterpillar or a larva held in its mother's womb in the earth. You can't go back, but you can learn to appreciate that butterflies, not for everybody. Some people are happy caterpillars, and they know more as caterpillars than you know as a butterfly. Because the short time you spent as a caterpillar, you just did not learn everything there was to be about being a caterpillar. And those of you who are born butterflies don't have the experience at all. Born in the suburbs, born already taking the hidden curriculum, right? Having extra math classes, extra music lessons from a very early age, camps, all those things. Okay. Let's read the next section too, because I'm up a little bit early, got a little extra time before school. This page 45, Dominance of Class, Wildwoods. Patton, where I grew up, was not racially diverse, unless you consider having English, Polish, Italian, German, Lithuanian, and mixed European ancestry diverse. One of my close friends in high school, a clarinetist, had Central American ancestry, but the few students of color were often in Patton due to adoptions or lived in an institution that housed low-level juvenile offenders. If I had to guess, I would say 99% of my friends were white. In my third year at university, however, I began dating a woman, an African American, who would become my wife, a flutist. I met her in the university band. Beginning in 1997, I joined my future wife's family for the yearly summer vacation in Wildwood, New Jersey. This was one of my first experiences living with African Americans. One of my roommates at university was Nigerian. And with being in a place that was predominantly African American and Hispanic. I was surrounded by the sounds of hip hop and R&B, though at the time I primarily listened to white alternative music. My future wife's family easily and quickly accepted me as family. Even with my failings and our differences, I felt welcomed. On that Sunday, I found a Catholic parish in the Yellow Pages. It was in North Wildwood. Only a few blocks away, my future wife and I drove to St. Anne Church, and the racial divide was immediately clear. I recognized that we were in an Italian part of town. The priest had a strong Italian accent that I found unintelligible. Patton had never had such an obvious racial divide. Perhaps this was because Patton was almost entirely white. Whites of various ancestry lived beside one another, and seemed to me that students of color were accepted. Wildwood, North Wildwood, seemed shockingly different. Experiences like this prepared me for my future job teaching in Pittsburgh. The Hill District and South Side may be geographically close, but they are culturally distant. In Pittsburgh, I thrive teaching in the so-called low socio-economic status schools. The schools that most teachers try to transfer out of. Many of my schools were predominantly African American, though others were more racially mixed. Our band, orchestra, and choir concerts were well received in their communities. My students performed well and were passionate about learning music from me, and were active in all city music concerts. More importantly to me, I felt a connection to my students I never had felt teaching in the Maryland suburbs. Certainly, teaching experience played some role in this. First-year teachers seldom are good teachers, but I felt camaraderie with my students rooted in shared economic struggles I had in my youth. For instance, I perceived among my students and in their communities a type of rebelliousness and skepticism towards institutions many think of as good. The theme dominance of class is a subjective experience of capital, guiding me more than other spheres. By it, I do not mean to suggest that class is a dominant theme for everybody. It is not universalizable. My experience with what I am calling dominance of class seems related to Cornel West's idea of inescapability in capitalist societies, the dominant dynamic process of capital accumulation and the commodification of labor conditions, social and cultural practices in an inescapable manner. West's concept doesn't negate the oppositional cultures of oppressed peoples that extend far beyond their workplaces, and neither do I. Yet, for me, class has been inescapable, and class consciousness became a foundation for my ethical teaching praxis among the social majorities in urban neighborhoods differing drastically from Patton. The historical fact of racial oppression, especially among economically oppressed white and African Americans in the U.S., cannot be refuted. The rolls of the KKK are filled with the economically oppressed whites from cities and small towns not unlike my own. I have been in many rooms where poor and middle-class whites uttered explicit and unacceptable racial slurs. To complicate matters, my lived experiences with whiteness and maleness may have guided my beliefs about the dominance of class in ways I am not yet aware. Conscientization is an ever ongoing dialectic, a continuous process of transformation. However, my experience in a social majority cultivated in me the ability to recognize oppression, in this case, that of African American students, and to connect meaningfully to people experience oppression personally and socially. And my haiku connected to that one: inequities abound, and the oppressed have at least a ghost of a chance. All right, so in that section on class, right? So at this point, I think it was Vincent Bates and me writing about class. That was it. Joe Abramo came in. Obviously, he's done a lot more than me at this point. I think Vince maybe still has done more than anybody else. Sean Powell also now, right? Kathy Benedict was doing, has class intrinsic to a lot of her work, right? For a long time, though it's never been centralized, right? In this theme, I centralize it, but in a very subjective manner, which makes it really hard to reference for people. I get it. I don't. It doesn't matter. I'm not like a tenure line. I don't need your references at this point. Nobody in my middle school observations is saying, how many references did you get? That they are in your tenure line dossier. Okay. So, my experience with class and poverty helped me to see the racial divide when I first came upon it. Now, it's notable that race was pretty invisible in Patton in the 90s, because I read later a book by the brother of my priest. So his last name would be Resco, where he's describing Patton in the so my priest in the 90s, who was a fairly old man then, who was Blaine Resco. His brother was a professor, I think in California or Oregon, and wrote a book, but he wrote a autobiographical book, which was so nice because you read those early sections and he's talking about Patton in the 1930s, 40s. I don't know, it's hard to conceptualize, right? Let's see, so probably the 30s would we get, my guess. I would think it's definitely the interwar period. But yeah, there was. So I noticed, remember I mentioned all of the different peoples? You know, Polish, Italian, German, Lithuanian, mixed European ancestry, right? English. So he mentioned how the English were in the nicer part of town, and then Polish in another. I think his ancestors were Hungarian, maybe, or maybe Czech. They were in another part. They were on the other side of Chess Creek, right? So I know all these areas, but they're not. They were not, and are currently not, right? Mixed on, based on those type of things, right? They're not. People don't live on them based on those divides, but those divides were there. And sometime between like the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, I don't know, to the 1990s, those divides were paved over, right? And a new identity as Pattonite emerged. So that's maybe hopeful, I don't know. It's something, right? Because how the social majorities reroot themselves, right? Those are all peoples that were uprooted probably from the from life of peasantry, right? Working the soil for thousands of years in different parts of Europe, and then found their way to Patton for work with the coal mines, and then the clay works. The clay works were then the dominant employer through the 1960s, right? So a lot of people came in for that. Very important clay works to history. Bobby Lee guitar straps, right? Factory was there through like the 1990s, right? Even when I was still there. Yeah, so people came for work, but all uprooted, but with similar experiences with the soil, right? And love for soil, and came to make a culture, a new culture, that of Pattonite. But the resilience of the social majorities is pretty amazing, right? And then seeing in the urban places where I had taught at that point, that same connection, right? That same connectedness to place, right? A north viewer was not not the same as a Spring Hill. They are completely different culture, even though they're right beside each other in the city, right? The social majorities make culture, just like worms make soil. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. In contrast, those who are tilling the soil, those who are cultures, those who cultivate, dig the soil, those who cultivate in universities end up losing soil. And this is why what once had, in the West, where we had 2 feet of topsoil down to 2 or 3 inches now, the breadbasket of the world where people can get food and eat, right? The cultivation can be very destructive. Well, have a blessed day.